The letter hit the worn pine counter with a sound like a gunshot, and Rosa Whitfield watched Peter Hale's face go utterly still. He had come into the post office with the look of a man already half defeated, his broad shoulders carrying the invisible weight of every injustice that the town of Harlow Creek had piled onto him over the past 3 months. His jaw was set hard beneath a week's worth of dark stubble, his gray eyes flat and cold as January creek water. He was a man who had learned not to expect anything good to come through a door, and yet here he was, standing in her post office, staring at an envelope that Rosa had just placed on the counter between them as if it were a lit stick of dynamite. "That letter," Rosa said, her voice low and even, "was never meant for your eyes, Peter. It was meant to reach Judge Aldous Crane in Tucson before you ever had a chance to defend yourself. It would have sealed your fate before you walked into that courtroom." Peter looked up from the envelope. His gray eyes locked onto hers, and she could see the exact moment the realization cracked through his defenses like a pickaxe through hard earth. Not just shock, not just anger, something deeper, something that shook the foundation of every assumption he had made about being alone in this fight. "You intercepted it," he said. The words came out flat, barely a breath. "3 days ago," Rosa confirmed. She did not flinch from his gaze. "Read it." His hands, large and rope-scarred from decades of cattle work, reached for the letter with a deliberateness that spoke of a man making himself stay calm when every nerve in his body was screaming. He unfolded it. She watched him read. She watched the color drain from his face and then rush back in a hot surge of fury. "Dale Mercer," he said, and the name came out like a curse, like something poisonous he needed to spit from his mouth. "He has been planning this from the beginning." "From before the beginning," Rosa said. "Before your father ever died." The silence that followed was enormous. Outside, the dry Arizona wind pushed a cloud of red dust down the main street of Harlow Creek, rattling the post office's single window in its frame. It was the autumn of 1883, and the town of Harlow Creek had been a place of festering secrets for longer than most of its residents cared to admit. Peter Hale set the letter down very carefully, as if it might still explode. He looked at Rosa Whitfield, and for the first time in 3 months of mounting isolation, of watching every man he thought he could trust turn away or turn against him, something in his expression shifted from granite to something more raw and unguarded. "Why?" he asked. Just that single word, but it carried everything inside it. Why had she done this for him? Why had she risked it? Why was she the one person left standing on his side of this town? Rosa took a slow breath. The answer to that question was going to take a while. She said, "Sit down, Peter. We have a great deal to talk about and not much time before someone notices you came in here." He sat. And Rosa Whitfield began to tell him the truth about Harlow Creek, about Dale Mercer, about the letter, and about herself. But to understand why any of it mattered, you had to go back to the beginning of the summer, when Peter Hale had first ridden into this town as its newest resident and greatest target. Peter Hale had inherited the Crow Hollow Ranch in late June of 1883 following the death of his father, Gerald Hale, a man who had spent 30 years building something worth leaving behind. Gerald had been a fair man, a quiet man, a rancher who had kept to himself but who had always paid his debts and kept his word. His son was much the same, forged from the same hard-working, plain-spoken material, though Peter carried the added weight of having spent 8 years away from Harlow Creek, working cattle drives up from Texas, and learning the land the way a scholar learns a language, one painful lesson at a time. Peter was 31 years old when he came home to bury his father and claim the ranch. He stood just over 6 feet tall, lean but powerfully built in the way of men who had never done anything easy in their lives. His hands were always rough. His voice was always measured. He had the kind of face that made people instinctively feel they could trust him, which was precisely why so many people in Harlow Creek had decided, on instructions from Dale Mercer, that they could not afford to. Dale Mercer was the kind of man who had built his empire not through honest work, but through strategic patience and ruthless timing. He owned the Harlow Creek Mercantile, the town's only bank, and the sprawling Mesa Ridge Ranch which bordered Crow Hollow on two sides like a pair of hands ready to close into a fist. For years, Mercer had been buying up land around Crow Hollow, waiting for Gerald Hale to either sell or die. When Gerald died, Mercer had been almost indecently quick to approach the estate with an offer, and he had not hidden his irritation when it became clear that Peter Hale intended to come home and run the ranch himself rather than selling. What Peter had not known when he rode into Harlow Creek that June evening was that Mercer had already spent weeks preparing the ground. He had spoken privately to the town's key figures, the sheriff, the feed merchant, the saloon owner, the circuit judge, and the handful of ranchers whose water rights depended on Mercer's goodwill. He had planted the seeds of a narrative that Peter Hale was reckless, that he had left debts behind him on the cattle trail, that he was not the kind of man his father had been. None of it was true. All of it was believed because Mercer said it with such smooth, regretful certainty, as a man who hated to speak badly of anyone but simply felt the town deserved to know. By the time Peter had been in Harlow Creek for 6 weeks, he had already felt the first cold drafts of that manufactured reputation. Men who had been his father's friends were suddenly vague and busy when he came looking for help hiring hands. The feed merchant quoted him prices 20% higher than he charged Mesa Ridge. The sheriff, a thick-necked man named Walt Decker, was openly dismissive when Peter came to report that his northern fence line had been cut and 12 head of cattle driven off. Peter was not a man who scared easily, but he was a man who recognized a siege. He knew what it looked like from the outside and from the inside, and he knew that a siege was only as effective as the isolation it created. What Mercer had not accounted for, what no one in his careful network of pressure and manipulation had thought to account for, was Rosa Whitfield. Rosa had been the postmistress of Harlow Creek for 4 years. She had taken the position after the previous postmaster, an elderly man named Franklin Oakes, had passed away from a lung complaint, and she had walked into the federal post office application process with the same methodical confidence she brought to every other thing she attempted. She was 28 years old that summer, the daughter of a schoolteacher father and a mother who had been, improbably and magnificently, one of the first female telegraph operators in the Arizona Territory. Rosa had grown up understanding that information was currency, that words on paper carried power, and that the person who controlled the flow of correspondence in a frontier town controlled a great deal more than just the mail. She was not tall, but she moved with the kind of self-possessed certainty that made people step back when she entered a room. Her hair was dark brown, thick, and always pinned up with the ruthless practicality of a woman who had no time for vanity and no patience for hair in her eyes. Her hands were ink-stained more often than not from the meticulous logbook she kept, recording every piece of mail that passed through Harlow Creek with dates, sender information, and recipient notation. She wore wire-rimmed spectacles for close work, and she had a habit of removing them when she was thinking hard, tapping one arm lightly against her chin. Rosa had known about Dale Mercer's methods before Peter Hale ever arrived in town. She had noticed things over 4 years of handling the post, patterns in the correspondence, letters arriving for certain men just before certain decisions were made, sealed packages that smelled faintly of money, a consistent stream of communication between Mercer's ranch office and a law firm in Tucson whose reputation, if you knew where to look, was considerably less than pristine. She had not had proof of anything specific. But Rosa Whitfield had a mind like a steel trap and a memory like a ledger, and she had been building a picture one carefully observed detail at a time. She had noticed Peter Hale the first week he came to collect his mail. Not because of his appearance, though she was not entirely immune to the fact that he was the kind of man who wore exhaustion and hard work the way other men wore fine coats, but because of his letters. He wrote to his former cattle drive employer requesting a reference. He wrote to a seed supplier requesting a catalog. He wrote to the Territorial Land Office requesting copies of his father's deed records. Every letter was purposeful. Every letter was the action of a man who intended to build something real and honest. She had also noticed that several of his expected return letters were arriving already opened, the seals carefully repressed with a close but not quite matching wax. She had said nothing at first, because she had no proof of who was doing it, and because in 1883 a postmistress who made accusations without evidence was a postmistress who found herself removed from her position. But she had begun to watch more carefully. The first real confirmation came in August, 6 weeks after Peter's arrival. A letter arrived addressed to Peter from the Territorial Land Office, the very office where he had requested copies of his father's deed records. Rosa had recognized the distinctive franking stamp immediately, and she had also recognized, with a cold certainty that settled in her stomach like a stone, that the envelope had been opened and resealed with a wax that was almost identical to the Territorial Office's seal, but not quite. Someone with access to the postal route between Tucson and Harlow Creek was intercepting Peter's mail and reading it before delivery. That was when Rosa Whitfield had shifted from observer to participant. She was a federal employee. Her position gave her specific legal authorities and specific legal responsibilities, and one of those responsibilities was the protection of the mail from interference. What she was observing was a federal crime. She documented everything she could. She began keeping a secondary logbook, private, locked in the small iron strongbox beneath the counter, in which she recorded every suspicious letter, every irregularity, every piece of correspondence that showed signs of tampering. And then, in the second week of September, the letter arrived that changed everything. It was addressed to Judge Aldous Crane in Tucson, written in the hand Rosa had come to recognize as belonging to Dale Mercer's personal secretary, a thin, nervous young man named Howard Tillies who had no idea what his employer truly was. The letter's outer envelope was unremarkable. It was the inner document, the one Rosa discovered when the envelope's compromised seal gave way entirely during her standard handling, that made her go still at her counter for a full 3 minutes, reading and rereading. The letter was detailed and methodical. It laid out a fabricated legal case against Peter Hale, accusing him of cattle theft, land fraud, and the falsification of his father's will. It cited witnesses, all of them on Mercer's payroll. It included a summary of supposed evidence, all of it manufactured. And it made a specific request of Judge Crane, that a warrant be issued for Peter Hale's arrest, and that a preliminary hearing be scheduled at the earliest opportunity, with a strong implication that the judge's cooperation would be remembered and rewarded by the most powerful rancher in the county. If that letter had reached Judge Crane, Peter Hale would have been arrested within the week. He would have walked into a courtroom facing manufactured evidence, paid witnesses, and a judge who had already been promised incentive for a particular outcome. He would have had no warning. He would have had no time to prepare. And given the isolation that Mercer had carefully engineered for him in Harlow Creek, he would have had no one in his corner. Rosa had held the letter in her ink-stained hands and made a decision that she knew could cost her her federal position, her home, and possibly her safety. She had placed the letter in her private strongbox. She had written a detailed account of the letter's contents, the signs of prior tampering on Peter's correspondence, and her own observations of the past 3 months into a formal report addressed to the federal postal inspector in Phoenix. She had sent that report with the morning stage, quietly, without telling anyone. And then she had waited 3 days, during which she had continued to run the post office with her customary calm efficiency, while underneath the surface of her composed exterior, her mind ran continuous calculations about timing, risk, and what happened next. She had sent word to the ranch through Billy Oakes, young Franklin's nephew who ran odd jobs around town, that Peter should come to the post office at midday on a Tuesday when the street traffic was lightest. She had not explained why. She had trusted that a man intelligent enough to survive 3 months of Mercer's siege would be intelligent enough to follow an oblique instruction from an unexpected source without broadcasting it to the whole town. He had come, and now he sat across from her in the post office with the letter on the counter between them and the whole elaborate machinery of Mercer's trap laid out in plain sight. "He planned this before my father died," Peter said again. He was not asking. He was integrating the information, pressing it against everything he had observed over the past 3 months, and watching it all lock into place. He knew Gerald Hale was ill. He started positioning himself before there was anything to position himself for. "He had someone in the doctor's office," Rosa said. She pulled another document from her strongbox, a letter she had noted months ago but had not fully understood until now. "This came through in February, addressed to Mercer from a name I did not recognize. I noted it because of the Tucson postmark and the fact that it was the third letter from the same hand in 2 months. I made a copy of the return address before I delivered it. It matches the address of a man named Caleb Rourke, who, according to the territorial directory I have here, is employed as a medical attendant in Harlow Creek." Peter looked at the notation in Rosa's precise, neat handwriting. "Caleb Rourke worked for Doc Alderman. He would have had access to my father's medical records. He would have known how quickly Gerald was declining." "Yes," Rosa said. The word landed quietly between them. Peter put both hands flat on the counter and looked at them for a moment as if centering himself. Then he looked up at Rosa with those gray eyes, and she saw something in them that she recognized, because she felt something of the same thing herself in this moment. It was the specific vertigo of discovering that the problem you were fighting was larger and more deliberate than you had imagined, and that the only way through it was forward. "You kept the letter," he said. "That is a federal matter. You could lose your position." "I have already filed a report with the postal inspector in Phoenix," Rosa said, "which means what I did is documented and justified under the Postal Protection Statutes of 1872. I did not simply intercept correspondence for my own purposes. I intercepted evidence of a federal crime and filed the appropriate report." He stared at her. "You already thought this through." "I have been thinking it through for 3 days," she said, with a precision that was not exactly pride but was not modesty either. It was simply accuracy. Peter Hale sat back in his chair and looked at Rosa Whitfield with an expression she had never seen on his face before, because she had only really observed him from a distance over the past weeks, watching a man who kept his jaw set and his emotions locked down as a matter of survival. What she saw now was not that controlled guardedness. What she saw was genuine, unguarded astonishment. "Who are you?" he said, and it came out not as a challenge but as a question he genuinely did not know the answer to and urgently wanted to. Rosa almost smiled. She found that she did not entirely mind the question. "I am the postmistress of Harlow Creek," she said, "and at the moment I am the only person in this town who can prove Dale Mercer has been committing federal mail fraud." The afternoon light moved across the post office floor in slow degrees while they talked. Rosa laid out what she had, systematically and without drama, because that was how she processed things in orderly sequence, with evidence attached to each claim. Peter listened the way good men listened, with his full attention, and his interruptions reserved for genuine questions rather than the performative kind. She showed him the copied addresses, the notation log, the timeline she had constructed from 3 months of careful observation. She showed him the letters she had noted as tampered with, cross-referenced against the dates of certain events in town. Sheriff Decker suddenly deciding to question Peter about a fence dispute, the feed merchant raising his prices, the hardware store owner refusing to extend credit. Each seemingly independent act of hostility toward Peter Hale occurred, Rosa had noted, within 5 to 7 days of a letter passing through the Harlow Creek post office addressed either to or from Dale Mercer. He coordinates through the mail, Peter said, looking at the timeline. Because he does not want men meeting at his ranch or in town where people might notice. He keeps everything at arm's length, so each person only knows their own piece. And most of them probably tell themselves they are simply following the lead of the most powerful rancher in the county, Rosa said. Mercer understands that most people do not need to be paid to cooperate with a powerful man. They only need to believe that cooperation is in their interest. Peter was quiet for a moment. That is a very dark view of people. It is an accurate one, Rosa said, then paused, with exceptions. He looked at her again with that direct, unguarded quality that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things he considered important. You are an exception, he said. The words were simple. They were not flattery. They were another of his accurate observations, the kind he made the way other men might notice weather or landscape, as a matter of practical reality. Rosa felt something move in her chest that she deliberately did not examine too closely in that particular moment, because there were more urgent things to address. We need to think about what happens next, she said. The postal inspector in Phoenix received my report. He will have questions and he will likely send an investigator. But that takes time, and in the meantime, Mercer will notice the letter never arrived in Tucson. He will eventually discover it was intercepted. When he does, the first thing he will do is come after the source. Which is you, Peter said, and there was nothing casual in his voice when he said it. Which is me, Rosa agreed. Then we need a plan, Peter said. He leaned forward, elbows on the counter. And for a moment they were close enough that Rosa could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the ones that came from years of squinting into sun and wind. He smelled of hay and horse and the cedar soap sold at the mercantile. And you need to tell me everything, not just the documents, everything you have noticed, everything you know about Mercer and the people around him, because if I walk into this blind, I walk into another trap. Rosa nodded. I will tell you everything, she said. But first, tell me who you trust, not who you think you should trust, who you actually trust. Peter thought about it, and the fact that it took him a full minute was its own kind of answer. Billy Oakes, he said at last. He is 17, but he is sharp, and he is not in anyone's pocket because nobody pays him enough attention to bother. Billy is reliable, Rosa agreed. He runs messages for me sometimes. Good instincts, who else? My foreman, Sam Cutter, been with my family for 20 years. Mercer tried to buy his loyalty twice and Sam told him where to go both times. He has not told me that directly, but I know Sam. Sam Cutter is honest, Rosa said. I see his letters. He writes to his sister in New Mexico every month without fail. A man that consistent does not have the temperament for duplicity. Peter blinked. You know a man's character from his letters. You know a great deal about a person from how they communicate in writing, Rosa said. The frequency, the tone, the care they take with language. It is not infallible, but it is informative. She paused. It is one of the reasons I noticed you when you first came in. Your correspondence was the correspondence of a man who was building something honestly. There was a moment of quiet between them that had a different quality from the previous silences, something warmer and less purely strategic. Peter cleared his throat. What about on Mercer's side? Who are the weak points? Who might be persuaded to step back from what they have been doing? Rosa thought carefully. The feed merchant, Ed Hawley, is not a corrupt man. He is a frightened one. Mercer holds the mortgage on his building. If Mercer fell, Hawley would revert to being simply Ed Hawley, who I genuinely believe feels badly about what he has been doing. He is not someone who will actively help us, but if things shift, he will not be an obstacle. She paused. Sheriff Decker is a different problem. He is ideologically committed to Mercer's vision, which is the vision of this county as Mercer's private territory. He will not step back voluntarily. And Judge Crane is a man who responds to legal authority and proper procedure, Rosa said, which is why Mercer's letter was so carefully crafted. It mimicked proper legal process while subverting it completely. If Judge Crane receives a report from the federal postal inspector documenting the attempt to manipulate him, his instinct will be to reassert his own integrity. Judges are particular about that. Peter looked at her steadily. You have been building this case for months. I have been building a picture, she corrected. I did not know what it was for until the letter arrived. But when it did, you were ready. I try to be ready for things, Rosa said simply. The afternoon was shifting toward early evening. The angle of the light through the post office window had gone from harsh and direct to something softer and more golden, laying itself across the wooden floor in long oblique bars. Rosa was aware that they had been talking for over 2 hours and that she should close the post office, and that the two of them being seen together for this length of time was a risk they had been taking more casually than they perhaps should. You should go, she said. Not by the front, through the back and down the alley to the livery. Peter stood, and the movement reminded her again of the sheer physical scale of him, not in a threatening way but in the way of a large animal that knows its own strength and has learned to be careful with it. He picked up the letter and then paused. I should take this with me, he said, but it was a question. No, Rosa said. It is safer here. This is a federal building. Mercer cannot search it without a federal warrant, which he cannot get without implicating himself. It stays in my strongbox until the postal inspector arrives. He put it down. Their hands were very nearly close on the counter for a moment, and neither of them moved away quite as quickly as they might have. Rosa, Peter said, and it was the first time he had used her first name without the formal prefix, and she noticed it the way you notice a change in the weather, as a physical fact before an interpretation. Why did you do this? All of it. You had no obligation to me. She looked at him directly, because she did not look at things any other way. Because what was happening to you was unjust, she said, and because I have the means to do something about injustice, which means I have the obligation to do something about it. That is not complicated. He looked at her for a long moment. No, he said softly, I suppose it is not. He left through the back. Rosa stood for a moment in the empty post office, her hand resting lightly on the counter where the letter had been, and she allowed herself to notice that something had happened today that was not only about justice. Then she picked up her logbook and went back to work. The next 3 days were a particular kind of tension, the kind that lived beneath the surface of ordinary activity and made everything feel slightly heightened. Rosa ran the post office with her usual efficiency, sorted the morning stage delivery, maintained her logbook, served the steady parade of townspeople who came in for their correspondence, and gave no outward sign that anything at all had changed. She greeted Ed Hawley when he came for his business correspondence with the same measured courtesy she always offered him, and she noted, as she always did, the faint shadow of guilt that crossed his face when he looked at her. She had sent a second dispatch to the postal inspector's office in Phoenix, more detailed than the first, including descriptions of the envelope tampering methodology and a specific request for expedited action, given the pending legal threat to an innocent party. She had also written a carefully worded letter to a lawyer in Tucson, a man named Oliver Farris, whose reputation for integrity had been established through the pattern of his correspondence, the kind of cases he took on as visible through the mail, his consistent ethical approach, and who had no visible connection to Dale Mercer. She had introduced herself as a federal postal employee with information relevant to a potential fraud case, and asked whether he handled such matters. Oliver Farris wrote back in 4 days, which was the fastest turnaround the Territorial Post reliably allowed. His letter was brief and professional, and said that he did indeed handle such matters, and that he would be most interested in receiving the full information at her earliest convenience. Rosa wrote back the same day. Meanwhile, Peter Hale had gone back to Crow Hollow and had spoken to Sam Cutter. He had not told Sam everything, because the fewer people who held the full picture, the fewer ways it could leak, but he had told his foreman enough to explain why things were about to change, and why Sam needed to be prepared for that. Sam Cutter, who had been watching his employer's son absorb one blow after another with increasingly worried eyes, had simply nodded and said, "What do you need me to do?" Which was the answer of a man whose loyalty was not conditional on easy circumstances. Peter also found himself thinking about Rosa Whitfield with a consistency and a specificity that he was unaccustomed to. He was not, by nature, a man who spent much time on introspection. He was a man of action, of movement, of physical work as a way of processing the world. But something about that conversation in the post office had shifted something in him, the way a rock can shift in a riverbed and change the direction of the current around it. He had met capable women before. His own mother had been a formidable person in her quiet way, managing the household and the ranch's bookkeeping with a precision that Gerald Hale had relied on utterly. He had met women on the cattle trail towns who ran businesses and managed finances with skill and toughness. He was not a man who underestimated women as a category, but Rosa was something he had not quite encountered before. The precision of her mind was extraordinary. She had been building a case against Dale Mercer for months before any of it was relevant to her, driven purely by what she had described as the obligation that came with means. She had worked through the legal and practical dimensions of what she had done with the intercepted letter with a thoroughness that would have impressed a lawyer. She had known exactly what risks she was taking, and had already begun mitigating them before Peter even knew she existed as an ally. He found himself going over the conversation in his mind with an attention to detail he did not usually apply to social interactions, replaying the precise, careful way she explained things, the way she had looked at him when she said she noticed him because his correspondence was the correspondence of a man who was building something honestly. He found himself returning to that sentence again and again, turning it over, looking at it from different angles. On the fourth day after their meeting, he rode into town on the pretext of needing supplies from the hardware store, a legitimate errand that gave him a reason to pass the post office. He had not planned to stop. He told himself he was not planning to stop. He stopped. Rosa was behind the counter sorting the morning delivery with her spectacles on and her sleeves rolled up to the elbow, a posture of such complete concentrated efficiency that he paused in the doorway for a moment before she looked up and saw him. She pulled her spectacles off and held them in one hand, the other still resting on a stack of envelopes. "Peter," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name without any additional formality. "I came for supplies," he said, and then heard how that sounded and added, "and I wanted to tell you that Sam Cutter is ready, and that I have been thinking about how to approach the question of witnesses." "Come in," she said. "I had some thoughts about that too." He came in and the door swung shut behind him. The post office was small and smelled of ink and paper, and the particular dry warmth of a room heated by a small iron stove. There were mail cubbies along one wall, and the counter running the width of the room, and a door behind Rosa that led to the small sorting room and storage. It was functional and entirely organized, every surface arranged with purpose, the logbooks aligned on their shelf, the ink bottles capped and in order, a small potted plant on the windowsill that was the only concession to anything decorative. "I have been in contact with Oliver Forrest in Tucson," Rosa said, pulling a letter from a specific cubby as if she had been keeping it ready for him. "He is a lawyer with a solid reputation and no connection to Mercer. I have sent him a full accounting of what I have, and he confirms that the material constitutes grounds for a fraud investigation. He also says he has reason to believe Judge Crane is not as thoroughly in Mercer's pocket as Mercer believes." Peter scanned the letter. "What reason?" "Crane ruled against Mercer in a water rights case 2 years ago," Rosa said. "Mercer has been assuming that particular approach to the judge will work because it has worked before with other officials. But Crane is a man who protects his judicial reputation. Forrest knows him somewhat. He believes that showing Crane documented evidence that Mercer attempted to manipulate him through fabricated accusations would produce outrage rather than cooperation. Turn the judge against him, Peter said. Make the judge an ally rather than an obstacle, Rosa said precisely. There is a difference. We do not want Judge Crane to be our advocate. We want him to be a fair and angry man who insists on proper procedure. Peter set the letter down and looked at her with that full attention that she was learning was simply how he engaged with things that mattered to him. You are very good at this, he said. At what exactly? She asked, not coyly but because precision was a habit. At understanding how people work, he said. What motivates them, what they protect. You understand it the way I understand cattle, the way I understand how a herd moves and what will make it do what you need it to do. Rosa considered this. I learned it from Mail, she said. 4 years of reading the patterns of how a community communicates. You learn what people want, what they fear, what they hide. Not the contents of their private correspondence, she added quickly, but the shape of it, the frequency and the direction. It is remarkable, Peter said, and there was nothing performative in it. It was the same direct, honest way he said everything, and Rosa felt the same movement in her chest that she had felt 4 days ago and had been steadily not examining. You should also know, she said, keeping her tone practical, that Billy Oakes came to me yesterday. He has been making deliveries around town and he overheard something at the Mercer Mercantile. Mercer has noticed the letter did not arrive in Tucson. He is asking questions about the stage schedule. Peter went still. How much time do we have? Before he traces it back to the post office, I estimate 4 to 6 days. He will check the stage records first, then the route rider, and when neither of those produce an answer, he will look at this end of the chain. She paused. I am not afraid of him searching this building. As I said, he cannot do that without a federal warrant, but I am aware that Mercer is not always constrained by legal process. The air in the room changed slightly. Both of them were aware of the implication she had just made without making it explicitly. He will not touch you, Peter said, and the way he said it was very quiet and very certain, and it was not a boast. I am not expecting him to, Rosa said calmly. I am expecting him to try to find another way to pressure me, which is why I have been keeping copies of everything relevant in 3 separate locations, one of which is not in this building. He stared at her. Where are the other copies? One with Oliver Farris in Tucson, which he has already received. One with the postal inspector in Phoenix, which arrived with my first dispatch. And one, she added, sealed in an envelope in the care of Reverend Hollies at the church, addressed to the territorial governor, with a letter of instruction that it be opened and sent if anything prevents me from personally retrieving it within 30 days. The silence that followed was the longest they had experienced so far. You set up a dead man's switch, Peter said slowly. I set up a contingency, Rosa said. The Reverend does not know what he is holding. He simply knows it is important. I trust him to follow the instruction, because he has a well-documented record of following through on commitments. Peter Hale put both hands on the counter and leaned forward slightly, and Rosa, who had been maintaining the exact right amount of composure throughout this entire conversation, found that up close and with that particular expression on his face, maintaining composure required a slightly higher level of conscious effort. Rosa, he said, in that quiet tone that carried everything. You have been protecting this case and yourself, and effectively me, with more strategic competence than any man I have ever ridden with. She met his eyes. I have had 4 years to learn this particular frontier, she said. Information is my terrain. I know it the way you know cattle range. I am shocked, he said. And then, with the ghost of something that was nearly a smile but was too serious to quite be one, and completely in your debt. Rosa felt warmth move through her that she was now entirely done pretending was not there. She simply did not act on it, because there were still things to be done and a case to be won and a dangerous man to be properly dealt with. But she stopped pretending to herself that what she felt in Peter Hale's presence was purely professional respect. Then pay your debt by staying alive and not doing anything aggressive toward Mercer before the postal inspector arrives, she said. I know that goes against your instincts. You presume to know my instincts, he said, but there was warmth in it. I know what kind of man you are, she said. From your letters and from here, she gestured at the space between them. Go get your supplies, come back in 3 days. I should have heard from Phoenix by then. He went. But he paused in the doorway and looked back at her, and neither of them said anything, but the moment itself said enough. The response from the Phoenix postal inspector arrived in 2 days rather than 3, which Rosa took as a sign that her dispatches had been taken seriously. Inspector James Hoyt wrote in the formal, thorough language of a federal official who understood the weight of what he was being told and was not inclined to move slowly about it. He confirmed receipt of her materials. He confirmed that the evidence she had described constituted a prima facie case of federal mail fraud. He confirmed that he would be arriving in Harlow Creek within the week with the authority to conduct a full investigation and to secure the relevant materials. He also wrote a brief additional note, in slightly more personal handwriting, at the bottom of the official letter. It said, Miss Whitfield, your documentation is the most thorough and well-organized I have seen from a field report in 8 years. It saved us considerable time. Well done. Rosa read this last part twice. Then she tucked the letter into the strongbox and went back to sorting the morning delivery. She sent word to Peter through Billy Oakes. The next 4 days had a quality of held breath about them. Peter received the message and sent back word through Billy that he understood and would keep to his ranch and keep Sam Cutter close. Rosa could feel the tension in the town as a palpable thing, not because anyone knew what she knew, but because Mercer's inquiries about the missing letter had generated a low-level unease in his network. Men who depended on Mercer's goodwill were nervous in the way people became nervous when a powerful man was looking for something he could not find, the uncertainty of not knowing what was coming making them more cautious and more watchful. On the second day, Ed Hawley came into the post office not for his business mail but clearly for some other purpose, hovering near the counter with the expression of a man who had something to say and was not sure how to say it. Rosa waited him out with patient efficiency, continuing to sort envelopes until he finally said in a low voice, Miss Whitfield, I want you to know that whatever is happening with the Mercer business, I am not part of it, not the part you might think. Rosa looked at him over the counter. Mr. Hawley, she said carefully, I am not sure what you mean. He swallowed. I mean that I was told things about Peter Hale that I believed because I had no reason not to. And that I have done things because of what I was told that I am not proud of, and that if someone were to ask me to say so in an official capacity, I would say so. Rosa was quiet for a moment. She thought about strategy and timing and the value of a cooperative witness. Then she said, if someone were to ask you that, Mr. Hawley, they would do so through proper legal channels. You understand what that means? I do, he said with the look of a man who has been waiting for someone to give him a way to do the right thing and has finally been handed it. Rosa made a note in her private logbook. Ed Hawley, she wrote, voluntary cooperation, conscience intact. On the third day, Sheriff Walt Decker came into the post office with his thumbs in his belt and his broad face set in the expression he used when he wanted to be intimidating. Miss Whitfield, he said. I hear you have been busy. Rosa did not look up from her work immediately. When she did, she met his gaze with complete steadiness. Good morning, Sheriff. What can I do for you? I want to know if there has been any irregularity in the mail service, Decker said. Specifically any interference with private correspondence. If you have a specific concern about a specific item of mail, Rosa said, you are welcome to file a formal complaint with the Federal Postal Service. As a federal employee, I am not required to respond to informal inquiries about mail handling practices. If you have a warrant, I will of course cooperate fully with whatever it authorizes. Decker stared at her. You are being very lawyerly for a postmistress. I am being very accurate for a federal employee, Rosa said. Was there anything else? He left. Rosa exhaled slowly once the door closed behind him. Then she went to the back room and sat on the small stool beside the sorting table for precisely 3 minutes, allowing herself to feel the full weight of how dangerous this moment was. Then she stood up, smoothed her skirt, and went back to the counter. Inspector James Hoyt arrived on the morning stage 6 days after his letter, 2 days earlier than his stated estimate, traveling with a federal marshal named Cord Reeves, who was a lean, watchful man of few words and considerable presence. They came to the post office first, which was proper procedure, and Rosa greeted them with the strongbox already open and the logbooks aligned on the counter. The meeting lasted 2 hours. Hoyt was thorough and intelligent, and he asked excellent questions. Reeves said almost nothing but missed nothing either. By the end, Rosa had turned over the original intercepted letter, her logbooks, the copies of tampered envelope notations, and her timeline documentation. She also gave them Ed Hawley's name and a carefully worded note about his willingness to cooperate. "Miss Whitfield," Inspector Hoyt said, near the end of the meeting, "I want you to understand that what you have built here, this body of evidence, is the kind of thing that takes investigators months to assemble. You did it while running a full post office operation and without alerting anyone to what you were doing. I am going to be putting a commendation in your file." "I would like it noted," Rosa said, "that the primary person harmed by what I documented is Peter Hale of Crow Hollow Ranch, and that any legal action taken should include the full restoration of his standing and the correction of any false records that have been created about him." "Documented and noted," Hoyt said. Rosa sent word to Peter. He came to town that evening, which was taking a risk, but Inspector Hoyt had made it clear that with a federal marshal on the ground the calculus had changed. Peter rode in with Sam Cutter and young Billy Oakes trailing behind, and he went directly to the hotel where Hoyt and Reeves were staying, which had been the agreed-upon meeting point. Rosa was already there, seated at the small table in the hotel's ground-floor meeting room, with her spectacles on and her hands folded, and the particular composed expression she wore when she was managing something complicated. Peter stopped when he saw her, and something crossed his face that she did not immediately classify, but that she would think about later. The meeting with the federal officials was productive and precise. Mercer would be served with a federal warrant the following morning. The evidence was sufficient for charges. The investigation would include a review of all the relevant land records, which would likely reveal further fraud beyond the attempted judicial manipulation. Oliver Farris in Tucson had been retained to represent Peter's interests formally, and would be traveling up within the week. After the officials concluded and excused themselves, leaving Peter and Rosa and Sam Cutter and Billy Oakes in the meeting room, there was a long exhale of collective relief that was almost comical in its completeness. "Well," Sam Cutter said, a large, weathered man of 52 who had been watching the proceedings with steady, watchful eyes, "I believe that is what they call the tide turning." "I believe it is," Peter said. He was looking at Rosa. Billy Oakes, who was young enough to say what everyone was thinking without the additional layer of adult restraint, said, "Miss Whitfield, that was about the most impressive thing I have ever seen in a room." Rosa smiled at him. "Thank you, Billy." Peter waited until Sam and Billy had gone out into the hotel lobby. Then it was just the two of them in the small room, with the kerosene lamp on the table between them throwing warm yellow light, and the sounds of the hotel and the street outside muffled and distant. "I do not know how to thank you," Peter said. "You do not have to thank me," Rosa said. "I told you, it was the right thing to do." "It was more than the right thing," he said. "It was extraordinary. What you built, what you protected, the way you thought through every contingency." He paused. "I have spent 8 years working cattle with men I trusted with my life. I have never had someone fight for me the way you have fought for me, not as a thing I needed, but as a thing that was simply right." Rosa took her spectacles off and set them on the table and met his eyes without them, which was a slightly more vulnerable configuration, and she was aware of that. "I would have done it for anyone in that position," she said carefully. "I know you would have," he said. "That is exactly what I mean about you." They looked at each other across the narrow table in the lamplight. "Peter," Rosa said, after a moment, "are you trying to tell me something that is not about federal mail fraud?" He almost laughed, a real laugh that changed his face entirely, cracking the granite and showing something underneath that was warm and genuine and younger than the set of his jaw usually suggested. "I believe I am," he said, "and I am making a poor job of it." "You are making a perfectly adequate job of it," Rosa said, and her voice had gone somewhat warmer than she generally let it go in professional contexts. But this was no longer a professional context, and she had decided to stop pretending it was. Peter reached across the table and covered her hand with his. His hand was large and rough and warm, and it was the first time they had touched, and the contact ran up Rosa's arm with a clarity that was not dramatic but was entirely unmistakable. "When this is over," he said, "when Mercer is dealt with and the ranch is secure and I am no longer the most beleaguered man in the county, I would like to spend time with you, not for strategic purposes." "I would like that too," Rosa said, with the same directness she brought to everything. His hand tightened slightly on hers. Then he let go, because they were in a hotel meeting room and there were proprieties, and both of them understood propriety even when they felt other things. Dale Mercer was served with his federal warrant the next morning. Rosa heard about it from Billy Oakes by mid-morning, who had positioned himself with impressive discretion near the mercantile and observed the whole proceedings. Marshal Cord Reeves and Inspector Hoyt had arrived at the Mercer mercantile at 8 o'clock, accompanied by a written warrant that Mercer's lawyer had examined with visible horror, and then handed back with the expression of a man whose own position had just become considerably more precarious. Mercer himself had been, by Billy's account, icily controlled. He had not shouted. He had not threatened. He had simply said, in the clipped tone of a man who was recalculating everything at great speed, that his lawyers would be in contact. But Billy had noted something else. He had noted that Howard Tillys, Mercer's young secretary, had gone pale as chalk when the warrant was read and had quietly stepped away from his employer and out the back door of the mercantile within 15 minutes of the official's arrival. Rosa had expected this. Howard Tillys was 23 years old and had, Rosa was fairly certain, been given very incomplete information about what he was facilitating when he wrote Mercer's letters on instruction. She had made a note in her dispatch to Hoyt about Tillys's likely status as an unwitting participant. By early afternoon, Tillys had appeared at the Federal Marshal's Hotel, asking to speak with Inspector Hoyt. By evening, he had provided a full accounting of every document he had prepared for Mercer in the past 18 months, which turned out to be considerably more than just the letter to Judge Crane. There was evidence of at least 4 other instances of attempted fraud, including the manipulation of a water rights deed that had affected 3 other ranching families in the county. The case against Dale Mercer became, in the space of about 48 hours, substantially larger than the one Rosa had originally documented. Over the following 2 weeks, the town of Harlow Creek underwent the specific disorientation of a community that has been organized around a source of power that has suddenly lost its force. Mercer was not arrested immediately. The legal process moved at its own careful pace, but his authority to affect the lives of others in the town collapsed almost instantly. Ed Hawley quietly lowered his prices back to their original levels and sent Peter Hale a letter of apology that was awkward and genuine in equal measure. The hardware store owner extended Peter credit with excessive enthusiasm, the particular overcorrection of a man who wants to be seen standing on the right side of history. Sheriff Decker, deprived of his patron's backing, became significantly less aggressive. He was, Rosa knew, a man whose corruption had been a matter of following power rather than ideological commitment, and with the power gone, he retreated into something closer to the tepid but not inherently dishonest law enforcement he was probably capable of on his best days. Peter came to town more often during this period. Some of the visits were for genuine ranch business. Some were for meetings with Oliver Forrest, who had arrived from Tucson with his case files and his sharp mind, and had taken an immediate liking to Rosa that was entirely professional and also entirely obvious. Some of the visits, Rosa knew without either of them saying so explicitly, were to see her. He would come into the post office and they would talk, first about the case and then about other things. She told him about her mother's work as a telegraph operator, and about growing up in a household where information was treated as a form of literacy as fundamental as reading or arithmetic. He told her about 8 years on the cattle trail, about the vast and lonely beauty of the land between Texas and Kansas, about the particular friendships that formed in those conditions, and the particular way they ended when the drive finished, and everyone scattered back to their own lives. He had an observational quality about him that she loved, the way he noticed things, the behavior of animals, the way the light fell on the mesa at different times of day, the small social dynamics of a town going through change. He described these things not with the elaborate language of a man performing sensitivity, but with the plain specificity of someone who had spent his whole life paying careful attention. She told him things she had not told anyone in Harlow Creek, because there had been no one in Harlow Creek with whom she had felt sufficiently seen to bother. She told him about the specific frustration of being exceptionally good at her work, and having it attributed to luck or to the relative simplicity of the job rather than to what it actually was, which was years of careful, intelligent effort. He listened to this with that full attention, and when she finished he said, "I know what that is like," with the kind of understanding that came from actual experience rather than polite sympathy. They were different in their ways of moving through the world. He was physical, instinctive, a man of action who thought on his feet and who solved problems with movement and decision. She was cerebral, methodical, a woman who solved problems by building the fullest possible picture of them first. But they shared a fundamental orientation. Both of them were honest, direct, hardworking people who believed in doing what was right because it was right, who kept their word and expected others to keep theirs, and who had a low and sincere tolerance for the kind of casual dishonesty that passed for social grace in many quarters. One afternoon in mid-October, about 3 weeks after Mercer's warrant, Peter asked if she wanted to ride out to see Crow Hollow. "Not for any particular purpose," he said. "Just to see it." Rosa, who had a riding horse of her own but who rarely had occasion to use her, said yes. They rode out in the cool October morning, Billy Oakes having been prevailed upon to watch the post office for 2 hours, with the strict instruction that he was only to hand out mail from the cubbies, and was not to touch the logbooks. The road from town to Crow Hollow ran through low desert scrubland, and then rose gradually through a landscape of red rock and juniper that opened eventually onto the wide, golden grassland of the ranch proper. Rosa pulled her horse to a stop at the crest of the rise and looked out across Crow Hollow, the long sweep of the grass and the dark thread of the creek running through the middle and the ranch buildings in the distance, low and solid against the mesa. "Father built this," she said. 30 years, Peter said, reining in beside her. "He came out here with $100 and a horse and a clearer sense of where he wanted to be than of how he was going to get there." "That is how most things worth having start," Rosa said. Peter looked at her with the direct warmth that she had stopped pretending she did not find completely disarming. "Will you stay in Harlow Creek?" he asked. "After all of this, when it is resolved, is this where you want to be?" Rosa looked out at the landscape. The October light was doing extraordinary things to the rock formations to the north, turning them shades of amber and rust that felt almost theatrical in their beauty. She had been asking herself this question since the age of 24, which was when she had first come to Harlow Creek, and the answer had always been provisional. Yes, for now, while things are as they are, while I have purpose here. But the answer she found herself giving now felt less provisional. "I am where I want to be," she said, and she was looking at him when she said it, and he knew what she meant. He reached across the gap between their horses and took her hand, and they sat like that for a while on the ridge above Crow Hollow, while the wind moved through the juniper, and the cattle moved in the far distance, and the light continued to do beautiful things to the rock. The formal hearing before Judge Aldous Crane was held in late November 1883, 6 weeks after Inspector Hoyt's arrival. It had taken that long to compile the full case, which had expanded considerably from Rosa's initial documentation. Oliver Forrest presented the evidence with the methodical clarity of a man who understood that a good case did not need theatrics. Judge Crane, who had been shown the letter that Mercer had sent attempting to manipulate him, had been, as Rosa had predicted, magnificently outraged. He had made a formal statement prior to the hearing that his court would not be subject to the interference of any party, and that he expected the full course of justice to proceed without impediment. Mercer's lawyer was good. He was not good enough. The combination of Rosa's documentation, Howard Tilley's testimony, Ed Hawley's cooperation, the land office records Oliver Forrest had obtained, and the forensic analysis of the tampered mail seals, which Inspector Hoyt's office had conducted with impressive thoroughness, constructed a case that was simply too complete to argue around. Dale Mercer was found liable on 3 counts of federal mail fraud and 2 counts of land fraud, with additional criminal charges to follow in a separate proceeding. The Mesa Ridge Ranch would be subject to investigation for properties acquired through fraudulent means. Several of those properties would be returned to their original owners or their heirs. Mercer would never again operate as a figure of commercial power in Harlow Creek, or, given the federal nature of his charges, anywhere in the territory. Sheriff Decker submitted his resignation the same afternoon the verdict was announced. The town of Harlow Creek held an election for sheriff 3 months later and voted in a man named Tom Birch, who had been running the livery stable with straightforward honesty for 6 years, and who had no particular political ambitions, but who was broadly trusted, which was exactly what was required. Peter Hale came into the post office the afternoon of the verdict's announcement and stood at the counter for a moment, and Rosa looked up from her work and saw on his face an expression that was the specific relief of a man who has been under siege for a long time and has finally walked out into open country. "It is done," he said. "It is done," she agreed. He came around the counter. It was the first time he had come around to her side of the counter, and the symbolism was not lost on either of them. He stood close enough that she had to look up at him, which she did without any inclination to step back. He reached up and touched her face with his rough, careful hand, and she put her own hand over his, and for a moment neither of them said anything because they did not need to. He kissed her there in the post office with the afternoon light coming through the window, and the logbooks aligned on their shelf behind them, and the smell of ink and paper and cedar soap all mixed together, and it was the most completely right moment Rosa had felt in a very long time. They were in no hurry after that. They had both of them lived enough to know that good things do not need to be rushed into their final shape, and that the best foundations are laid carefully. They spent the winter getting to know each other in the ordinary way, meals and conversations and Sunday afternoon rides and long evenings where they sat across from each other reading, and the comfortable silence of 2 people who have found that they are easy in each other's company, which is one of the most profound forms of compatibility. Peter asked Sam Cutter's opinion, not for permission, but for the counsel of a man whose judgment he trusted on matters of character. Sam Cutter, who had formed his own opinion of Rosa Whitfield during the legal proceedings, said that she was the sharpest, most principled person he had met in 30 years of frontier life, and that Peter would be a fool not to marry her. Peter found this assessment consistent with his own. Rosa was writing letters to her mother in Flagstaff during this period, and her mother, who was 60 years old and still operating a telegraph station with brisk competence, wrote back letters that were perceptive and warm, and that contained, between their lines, a quality of approval that Rosa had not realized she was hoping for until she felt its presence. In March of 1884, on a Sunday afternoon after they had ridden up to the ridge above Crow Hollow, as they had made a habit of doing, Peter asked Rosa to marry him. He did it simply, the way he did everything important, without elaborate staging or performative gesture, looking at her directly and saying that he loved her and that he wanted to build his life with her, and that he understood she had her own work and her own mind and her own way of being in the world, and that he did not want any of that to change. He only wanted to be part of it. Rosa, who had not cried when Mercer was found liable, who had not cried when Inspector Hoyt commended her work, who had not cried through the entire long and difficult autumn of that year, found that her eyes were somewhat wet. "Yes," she said. "Obviously yes." He laughed, that real laugh that changed his whole face, and put his arms around her, and she let herself be held in the uncomplicated way of someone who has found where they belong. They were married in June of 1884, a year almost to the day after Peter Hale had first ridden into Harlow Creek. The ceremony was held at the small church where Reverend Hollies had been unknowingly safeguarding Rosa's contingency envelope for the better part of a year. When Rosa told him, before the wedding, what he had actually been holding, the Reverend had gone slightly pale, and then said that in his 40 years of ministry he had never before held a sealed letter to the territorial governor, and that he was very glad he had not had to send it. The wedding was attended by most of Harlow Creek, because there is something in a community that responds to the specific combination of justice being served and two good people finding each other. Sam Cutter stood up beside Peter with the dignified satisfaction of a man watching something turn out the way it should. Billy Oakes wore his best shirt and tried to look as if he were not moved, which he entirely failed to accomplish. Rosa's mother came down from Flagstaff and sat in the front row with the upright posture of a woman who had spent 40 years around telegraph instruments, and whose back had never once conceded to the casual posture of lesser circumstances. Oliver Farris, who had come to genuinely like both Peter and Rosa during the months of legal proceedings, attended as a guest and was seated next to Inspector Hoyt, who had made the trip from Phoenix specifically because, as he said to Rosa privately, he had never before attended the wedding of a woman whose casework had been more impressive than most of the professionals he employed. Ed Hawley brought a gift and shook Peter's hand with a grip that said everything the awkward words of his apology letter had not quite managed. Peter accepted it with the directness that was characteristic of him, a firm handshake back and nothing further said, because some things are better closed than dwelt upon. Rosa kept her position as postmistress. This had been a matter of considerable discussion, both with Peter, who had supported it without reservation, and with herself, because she understood that the world she lived in would have opinions about a married woman in a federal position. She had decided, with the same methodical clarity she brought to everything, that the world's opinions were less relevant than the fact that she was excellent at her work, that the community needed excellent postal service, and that a federal appointment was not subject to local social pressure. She was correct on all three counts. Peter rebuilt Crow Hollow over the following years with the same patient, determined quality that characterized everything he did. The land that had been under threat from Mercer's manipulation was now entirely secure, the deed records corrected and properly filed, the water rights established beyond challenge. He expanded his cattle operation gradually and honestly, hiring men on the basis of competence and integrity, which produced a smaller but far more effective operation than the bloated, fear-based structure that Mercer had built next door. The Mesa Ridge Ranch was eventually sold in parcels, some to neighboring families who had been displaced by Mercer's manipulation, some to new settlers who came through the region following the expansion of the Territorial Railroad. The land found new lives. Their first child was born in the spring of 1885, a boy they named Gerald James Hale, the first name for Peter's father and the second for Rosa's father, who had been a school teacher and a quiet, steady man who had taught Rosa that intelligence was a tool and that tools were for using. Gerald James came into the world with his father's gray eyes and his mother's concentrated expression, and he regarded his new circumstances from his first hours with an air of systematic assessment that made Rosa laugh and Peter say that he had suspected this was coming. In the years that followed, they built the kind of life that does not often feature in dramatic stories, because it is too complex and too real, and too full of small joys to reduce to a single arc. There were difficult seasons, a drought in 1886 that tested the cattle operation severely, a difficult negotiation over water rights with a neighboring ranch that required 3 months of Rosa's careful mediation, a winter illness that swept through Harlow Creek and left 2 families without parents, and required the entire community to reorganize itself around the gaps. There was also the specific domestic pleasure of a household run by 2 people who each had genuine competence and genuine respect for the others. The way Peter learned to read Rosa's quieter moods, the particular stillness that meant she was working through something complex, and would bring her a cup of coffee and leave her to it without making the stillness into a demand. The way Rosa learned that Peter's occasional stretches of wordlessness were not withdrawal, but the particular silence of a man who processed the world through physical activity and needed that processing space, and that the right response was to ride out with him or sit on the porch with him and simply be present, which she found she was glad to do. The way they argued, directly and without cruelty, and the way those arguments had the quality of 2 people who respected each other enough to be entirely honest about disagreement. The way they resolved things, not through one party conceding to the other, but through the genuine synthesis of 2 intelligent perspectives, which produced solutions better than either of them had started with. Rosa continued to build her knowledge of the postal system and its legal dimensions. In 1887, she wrote a detailed report on mail security practices in frontier territories that was circulated by the Federal Postal Service to all territorial inspectors, and that was cited for years afterward as a foundational document in the field. Inspector Hoyt, who had retired from active field work by then, wrote her a letter of congratulation that she kept in her desk. Peter, in the same year, was elected to the County Cattlemen's Association, which was a position he had not sought but accepted, because the previous association had been organized around the kind of patronage politics that Mercer had perfected, and the ranching community needed someone whose instinct was toward honest dealing rather than strategic alliance. He held the position for 4 years, and used it primarily to establish fair water-sharing agreements and to push for proper legal recording of grazing rights, both of which benefited the smaller ranching families in the county more than the larger ones, which was exactly the point. Their second child, a daughter they named Clara Estelle, arrived in 1887. She had Rosa's dark hair and her father's steady, evaluating gaze, and from her earliest months made it very clear that she intended to be involved in whatever was happening in any room she occupied. Gerald James, by then 2 years old, regarded his sister with the philosophical acceptance of a child who has not been consulted about a major household change, but has decided to make the best of it. The post office grew busier as Harlow Creek grew, the town expanding in the years following the railroad's extension through the county as new residents arrived and new businesses established themselves. Rosa managed the expansion with her characteristic methodical competence, training 2 part-time assistants, and developing a sorting and delivery system that the Postal Service eventually used as a model for other frontier offices. She was, by the early 1890s, something of a known figure in territorial postal administration, not in a dramatic way, but in the quiet, deeply established way of someone who has been doing something very well for a long time and has influenced the practices of their field. She was also, in Harlow Creek, simply the postmistress, which was the best possible version of that fact. Billy Oakes, who had been 17 when the Mercer affair unfolded, and who had spent those years watching Peter and Rosa build what they built, went on to study law with Oliver Forrest's sponsorship, and became, eventually, a competent and scrupulously honest attorney in Tucson who had a specific and notable dislike for men who used institutional power to manipulate vulnerable parties. He visited Crow Hollow every year at Christmas, by which point there were 4 Hale children running across the ranch yard, and he always brought presents and always sat at the kitchen table with Rosa and Peter for hours after the children were in bed, talking about cases and cattle, and the specific texture of the life they had all built from the wreckage of what Mercer had tried to do. Sam Cutter stayed at Crow Hollow until his retirement in 1893, by which point Gerald James was old enough to begin learning the ranch from the ground up, and Sam had made it his personal mission to teach the boy everything he knew, which was considerable. When Sam finally left to spend his final years with his sister in New Mexico, Peter rode with him to the stage, and they shook hands for a long time without saying very much, because neither of them were men who needed many words for the things that mattered most. Howard Tillys, the young secretary whose testimony had helped bring Mercer's operation down, had moved away from Harlow Creek shortly after the trial and had gone, Rosa had heard, to California, where he had found work in an entirely different field. She hoped he had found his way to something honest and fulfilling. She had never thought of him as a villain, and she hoped the rest of his life had confirmed that judgment. Dale Mercer served time in the territorial prison at Yuma and was released in 1890, a diminished man whose capacity for manipulation had depended entirely on his position of power, and who, stripped of that position, was simply a shrewd but no longer particularly dangerous old man. He did not return to Harlow Creek. Rosa had no feelings about this beyond the flat, satisfied finality of a matter correctly resolved. On an October evening in 1891, 8 years after the events that had changed both their lives, Peter and Rosa sat on the porch of the Crow Hollow ranch house in the last of the day's warmth. The children were inside, the sounds of their various activities audible through the open window in the specific domestic texture of an occupied household. The mesa to the north was doing its theatrical thing with the light again, burning amber and rust against the evening sky. Peter put his arm around Rosa's shoulders, which was where it had settled naturally approximately every evening for 7 years, and she leaned into him, which was where she had been settling approximately every evening for the same period. "I was thinking today," Peter said, "about that afternoon in the post office, when you put the letter on the counter." 8 years ago last month, Rosa said. She had a very precise memory for dates. "I walked in there the most isolated man in the county," he said. "I had spent 3 months being shut out of everything and everyone. I thought Harlow Creek had decided I was not worth standing up for." He paused. "And then there you were." Rosa tilted her head to look up at him. The light was falling across his face in a way that showed the years in it, the good, earned way of a man who had worked hard and lived honestly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deeper now, and the dark hair showing threads of gray at the temple. She found him more beautiful than she had when he was 31, which was something that surprised her not at all. "There I was," she agreed, "with the most precisely documented case of federal mail fraud I have ever seen," he said, and his voice carried that warm, slightly self-deprecating amusement that she had come to love as one of the specific sounds of her life. "Well," Rosa said, "I had been building it for 3 months. Did you know then, that day, what you felt?" She thought about this honestly because she always thought about things honestly. "I knew something had happened that did not feel purely professional," she said. "I knew I was more than intellectually invested in what happened to you, but I told myself there were more urgent things to address." "There were," Peter said. There were, Rosa agreed. But I also knew, she said more quietly, that when you said you were shocked and completely in my debt, you said it the way a man says something that is not only about the thing he says it about. He was quiet for a moment. You noticed that. I notice everything, she said. It is my particular skill. He pulled her closer, and she let herself be held, there on the porch of Crow Hollow with the evening doing its beautiful things to the sky and the children inside, and the cattle grazing in the far pasture, and the whole long, built life of them spread out around them in every direction like a landscape they had made together. "Rosa," he said against her hair. "Yes," she said. "I am still shocked," he said. "Every day." She smiled, and it was the particular smile she kept for him, the one that had nothing of professional composure in it and everything of the specific warmth she had learned to stop managing. "Good," she said. "I prefer to be surprising." The October evening settled around them, soft and vast and full of the particular peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from having faced difficulty with integrity and come through it into something real. Inside, young Gerald James called for his mother about something, and Clara's voice answered him with the bossiness of a younger sibling, who has already determined that she is more competent than her older brother in every relevant respect. Rosa and Peter listened to their children argue for a moment with the relaxed attention of parents who have learned the difference between the sounds that require intervention and the sounds that do not. This was the latter. Clara would manage it. She always did. The stars were beginning to come out over the mesa, one by one in the darkening blue, the way they always did in Arizona, with a gradual and then sudden abundance that never stopped being extraordinary. Peter Hale, who had ridden into Harlow Creek 3 months before his world was put right as the most beleaguered and isolated man in the county, held Rosa Whitfield, who had given him back his life, and then given him something far larger than that, and felt, in the complete and uncomplicated way of a man who has found his place and his person, entirely and wholly whole. Rosa, who had spent 4 years in a frontier town learning to read the patterns of a community through the mail it sent and received, who had built a case from carefully observed details and quiet courage, and the conviction that what was right was worth the cost of doing it, rested her head against her husband's shoulder and watched the stars come out and was, in the specific, earned, deeply satisfied way of a woman who has lived her life on her own terms, and found that those terms include love, completely happy. The night came in full over Crow Hollow, and the light in the ranch house windows was warm and yellow against the dark, and the land lay all around them, honest and hard and beautiful, the way the best things are.